turn in your Bible to Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2. We want to look at verse 8 as kind of a launching point for tonight. Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. As you find your place in Colossians 2, listen to some introductory comments. Drive down the highway, and it won't be too many miles before you are confronted with billboards advertising this. Watch a sporting event, and you'll be bombarded with commercial breaks featuring this. Visit your local library, and you'll see a whole section of books dedicated to promoting this. What is this? Try and watch a regularly scheduled drama on syndicated television, and you'll likely, within that 40 to 45 minutes of programming, be confronted with at least one scene or situation implying, if not explicitly, revealing this. Jump on social media, and if you wanted to, it wouldn't be hard to find a thread where people are debating this. What is this? Let's read Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive. So evidently, this is a real possibility for the Christian. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy, human wisdom, and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of this world, and not according to Christ. So we, as Christians, are to be very wise, cautious, careful, and discerning when it comes to worldly philosophies. The question that I have for you to consider tonight is this: why is our society so consumed, absorbed, fascinated, enthralled, myopically focused upon sex and sexuality? Why? Why is it all over highway billboards? Why is it included in every sporting event commercial break? Why are there sections, not just dedicated to it, but front and center, promoting it in local libraries? Why can you no longer watch an innocent hour of television without being smacked across the face with something that you didn't want to see? Why are social media threads filled with debates or arguments surrounding sexuality? Why? Now I want to give you two answers. I'd like to first give you a Christian response, and then I would, secondly, like to give you a worldly response. Let's begin with the Christian response. The Christian response, I think, would go something like this. You might be able to improve it. This was my best attempt at the Christian response. The Christian response might go something like this: we are not consumed, we are not fixated upon, we are not idolatrously bowing down at the foot of sexual pleasure, sexual activity, and or sexual identity. We would reject the accusation. We are consumed with Christ. Now, we would follow up that little bit of a pushback by saying something like sexual intimacy, though, between a man and a woman united in marriage is a means of glorifying God and being obedient to his procreative command. Genesis 1. Filling the earth with image bearers who will worship God and reflect his glory. The gifts of God, from the Christian perspective, are never greater than the giver of the gifts himself. That is God. So, from a Christian perspective, to be consumed with sex is to not be Christian. Let me repeat that. From a Christian perspective, to be absorbed with all things sex, sexuality, that would be very unchristian. We would view that type of focus as idolatry. Now, however, this doesn't mean that we are indifferent to sex. Sexual intimacy as ordained by God in Genesis 1 and 2 is good. Right? At the end of Genesis 1, God looks on everything that he had made, and behold, it was not just good, it was very good. It was good. And sexual intimacy, as ordained by God, guides men and women towards human flourishing. And what I mean by that is this. There is a trajectory set at the very beginning of Genesis that human flourishing involves filling the earth with righteous image bearers that will glorify God and fill the earth with his knowledge and glory. And sex is an integral part of the fulfillment of that narrative. Given the importance of sex to God's plan for the earth, Christians naturally anticipate that Satan and fallen humanity together as the enemies of God will assault God's institution of marriage. We expect that. If sex and sexuality are strategically part of God's plan for filling the earth with righteous image bearers who honor him and reflect his glory, then we would expect the foe of God, Satan, to want to attack this very integral part of God's plan. So as Christians, we expect for Satan and for fallen humanity who are enslaved to Satan as the enemies of God, we expect them to assault the institution of marriage. We expect them to barrage the gift of sexual intimacy and seek to undermine God's design for the natural family. We just expect that because it just makes sense. Now, how would the world respond to this question? How would the world say, why are you so consumed with sex? Here's what I think the world would respond with. Sex/sexuality is fundamental to human authenticity, personal flourishing, and political freedom. Three ideas I want to get across to you to help you better understand the world in which we live. From a worldly perspective, sex, it's fundamental to human authenticity. It's an absolute essential for personal flourishing, and it's a foundational element of political freedom. Now, in order to help you understand the modern world that we live in that is consumed with sex, we need to understand several different influencers whose ideas have led to the sexual revolution that surrounds us. Several influencers. So we're going to talk about three men and their three main ideas and how it's shaped the present reality that you and I live in. So let's begin with the first man, the first idea, the first way in which the world views sex. The world views sex as fundamental to human authenticity. Fundamental to human authenticity. Let me explain what that means for those that might be younger. What is human authenticity? It's the idea of being real, being true to who you are at the core. And in order to understand who shaped this modern mindset, we have to go back to the 18th century and a man by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is important for two reasons. Reason number one, he was an inspiration for the French Revolution and the movement known as Romanticism. Reason number two, Rousseau exerted a profound influence upon another key figure that we'll look at tonight, Sigmund Freud. I want to read you a quote now from a book written by Carl Trueman, The Rise of the Modern Self. Here's what Carl Trueman says concerning the impact of Rousseau. He says as follows: as one of the key intellectual progenitors of both the French Revolution and Romanticism, he exerted considerable influence on the ideological formation of the modern world. As one of Sigmund Freud's heroes, his fingerprints can be found even on the rise of the psychoanalytical movement of the late 19th century. So what exactly did Rousseau teach? Well, in Rousseau's writings, he emphasizes the inner psyche as being the residence of one's true self. I'm going to give you a quote from one of Rousseau's more well-known works. It's called Confessions. It structurally follows the narrative of Augustine's autobiography. Rousseau says, and I quote now, "No one can write a man's life except himself." Let's pause there and try to digest that. I can't write about Emmett's life. Why? I don't have access to Emmett's inner psyche. The only person that knows Emmett as he truly is Emmett himself. Does that make sense? And you may not completely reject that idea. There's a lot of truth in what Rousseau is barking at here, but there's some falsehood as well. Let me continue with this quote from Rousseau. "No one can write a man's life except himself. His inner mode of being, his true self, is known only to himself." All right, let me say that again. His inner mode of being, his true self, is only known to himself. And yet, here's what Rousseau thought of humanity. He disguises it. You walk around not wanting people to know who you really are. Under the cover of his life story, Rousseau continues, he offers an apology. He presents himself as he wants to be seen, not at all as he is. End quote. Now, Rousseau in his writings, he, like a farmer sowing seed, he sows three consequential ideas in his writings. Idea number one, the inherent goodness of man. Now, this is not unique to Rousseau, but this is such a part of his romanticism. Rousseau tells the story in the book Confessions of a local man from his village who persuades him to steal from the local man's mother some asparagus so that the local man, his friend, could sell it at the market and make some money. Rousseau says in this book, Confessions, his own autobiography, he says this: his motivation was, and I quote, "only to oblige the person who was making him do it." And this theme runs all throughout Rousseau's autobiography. Anytime Rousseau does something that we would consider wrong, that we would consider sinful, that we would label a vice, anytime Rousseau does that and he writes about it, he always points the finger at someone else. Sounds like Adam, right? Sounds like Eve. So Rousseau argued that his nature, his bent, was actually very good until his nature would be violated, impacted, pressured by others. Then his nature would be spoiled. Second thing that Rousseau taught the little seed that he sowed was this: the inherent corruptness of social institutions. So Rousseau had to give an account for why are humans so prone to sinful activity. If we are inherently good, why don't we see that goodness manifested in the communities around us? Why are we lied to? Why are we stolen from? Why do people do violence towards others? Why do people envy, etc., etc.? Rousseau said the problem was social institutions. So for some of you that are literary nerds, like this flows right into your understanding of romanticism. Romanticism has this view that primitive man in nature, rural, rustic man who's not being impacted by society and societal structures, that man is good. Modern man, civilized man under the pressure of government, education, religion, and economics, that man is the evil man. Now, in Rousseau's narrative, he blames all his vices upon social conditions. It's because his master treated him badly that he confesses to becoming lazy and deceitful. It's because his father was too harsh to him that he becomes manipulative and covetous. The key idea for Rousseau is that human faults are always the result of corrupting influences. In another book, The Discourses and Other Early Political Writings, Rousseau imagined what humanity was like before the rise of social institutions when humans lived in primitive nature. Now let me give you a quote concerning that book. This quote, again, is from Carl Trueman. Trueman says this concerning Rousseau's book, The Discourse and Other Early Political Writings. Trueman says, "There was no discontinuity or disconnect between what individuals thought or wanted or how they behaved." Let me repeat that. In nature, primitive man not corrupted by societal forces, in that place, what will you find? A man who is true to his thoughts. He's true to his desires. He is true in his behavior. That man is as he really is. He has no pressure to put on a mask. He has no person to envy or take from. He's good because he's alone. It was a world in which what you see is what you get where people are concerned. It is therefore the socializing of the human condition that has created the various problems that now afflict us. All right, here's the third idea that Rousseau sowed. The inherent goodness of man, the inherent corruptness of civil institutions, and then the third seed that he sowed was this. He rooted ethics in personal sentiment and not natural law. How do you know what's right? How do you know what's wrong? No appeal to God, no appeal to the created order, no appeal to any type of religious text or revelation from God. How do you know what's really right or what's really wrong? Personal sentiment. Personal sentiment. Why? Because you at your core are good. And it's actually all the structures of society that are corrupting. And so this positive belief in the goodness of man is what he anchored his ethics in. Now, this is really technical, and this may bore you, but I'll do it really quickly. He talked about two types of self-love. He used two different French terms that translated into English are the same English term. He talked about self-love. He used a term called amour de soi, and then he used a term called amour propre. Now, this first type, amour de soi, love of self, it's what you possess naturally before you're corrupted by society. And it's this type of self-love that moves you towards self-preservation, empathy, moral action. Listen to this quote from Rousseau. "Justice and goodness are true affections of the soul, enlightened by reason. They're an ordered development of our primitive affections." That comes from a writing of his called Emily. And then, concerning this other type of self-love, called amour propre. He says this: amour propre is only a relative sentiment. It's born in society, and it inclines every individual to set greater store by himself than by anyone else. It inspires men with all the evils they do to one another. It happens to be the genuine source of honor. What is he saying? What is he saying? There are two types of self-love. One you're born with, and it's good. It actually leads you to such things as goodness and justice. But then there's another type of self-love that is introduced by society. And this self-love that is introduced by society tends to be corrupting, leads to all manner of evil. Now, what is the consequence of Rousseau? What's the consequence of Rousseau when it comes to education? Think with me. For Rousseau, if man's sentiments are good and society is corrupting, then here's what education needs to focus on. You must allow youth to mature without exposing them to cultural influences that feed amour propre. You've got to protect them from religion. You've got to protect them from the wrong type of politics. You have to protect them from the wrong type of economic structures, mainly capitalism. What Rousseau rejected was the concept that the purpose of education was the instruction of a person to prepare them for society, instructing them intellectually, instructing them morally, instructing them socially. Rousseau proposed you only need to do that if humanity is inherently sinful. Now I want you to think about We're laying a foundation for all of us to better understand the world in which we live today. What is the emphasis today in modern education? Is it on instructing the mind? As far as the intellect, sharpening your understanding of reading, writing, rhetoric, arithmetic? Is it instructing you morally so that you function well in a society that is ordered by God and under God? Does it instruct you, our current education system, on how we're to socially interact, promoting institutions of marriage, promoting how to relate to those that aren't part of your family, showing proper respect to elders? Or is the bent in modern education, we want to kind of keep God out? Religion's oppressive. We really don't want to promote the traditional economic structures. After all capitalism does is awaken greed, selfishness, excess. So there's a very huge consequence of Rousseau on education. Now, I want to give you another quote from Truman. Truman says this: "There is now no consensus about what it is that should evoke our empathy or sympathy. The baby in the womb or the pregnant teenager confronted with an unwanted pregnancy, the transgender teen who wants to become a woman, or their parent who feels their child is about to make a terrible mistake in transitioning to a woman." What Truman is talking about is this. In Rousseau's day, Rousseau still believed in God, though he was not a fan of organized religion. He had a really high view of the human conscience, which was a gift of God from his perspective. Rousseau was not prepared for his ideas to exist in a world completely unanchored to the reality of God. So what Truman is talking about is if you root your ethics in personal sentiment, who do you side with today? If empathy guides you to what is morally right, who are you to be empathetic towards? The teenager with an unwanted pregnancy or the child in the womb that would like an opportunity to live? Who are you to be empathetic for? The young person that feels the only hope for them is transitioning to the opposite gender? Or the parent who looks at the very child and thinks that their child is mentally confused and that type of transitioning will harden them? Who do you empathize with? And our society today struggles with who to empathize with, depending on the background, depending upon your life stage, because we have detached ourselves from God, from His revelation. So, in conclusion, with reference to Rousseau said society must be arranged in a manner that agrees with self-love. Childhood and youth are exalted because they're less influenced by amour propre. Now think about this. In most movies, maybe from 1980 and beyond, who's always the wisest person in the movie? Typically, it's the youngest. Now, where does that come from? Where does that come from? A lot of that is rooted to the influence of Romanticism. Because it's the youth who have not been spoiled by the corrupting influences of society. Who has been spoiled by the corrupting influence of society? The people who've lived in society the longest. So who are not wise? The elders. We should laugh at that. But that's exactly what they suggest. Now, here's probably the thing Rousseau is most well known for. The authentic person is the one who behaves outwardly in accordance with his or her inner psyche. That is Romanticism. The authentic person is the person who resists the pressures of religion, resists the pressures of family and government, resists the pressures of anything that does not align with their sense of who they are. Now, in Rousseau's day, he would never have fathomed modern transgenderism. He didn't have a category for that. But he, as far as the Western philosophies go, he's the father of this pursuit of authenticity. Rousseau and Romanticism. All right? Let's deal with person number two. Person number two. So our world sees sex as something that is fundamental to authenticity. Our world sees sex as something that is fundamental to personal identity. So along comes Sigmund Freud. And guess who Sigmund Freud idolizes? Rousseau. And Sigmund Freud comes along in the early 20th century. We call him today the father of modern psychology. And Freud is significant because of two things that Freud affects. Number one, Freud shifts sex from being what it is in the Christian worldview. It's a good gift of God that is given for the purpose of procreation and glorification, side purpose of pleasure and enhancement of the marital bond. He shifts sexual intimacy from that to a defining element of personal identity. A defining element of personal identity. Sex is no longer what you do, sex is who you are. Now, what's super significant about Freud is he provides a scientific explanation that carries great rhetorical power in the modern era. He is to the scientific theory of evolution what Darwin was to evolution, Freud is to the modern understanding of sex. Both men didn't create these ideas on their own. There's nothing new under the sun, but their theories sounded just smart enough to gain a profound credibility and following. By developing his psychoanalytic theory of human development, Freud gave people a better understanding of why sex was something fundamental to identity. Here's what Freud did. He was able to theorize the entirety of your human development. From birth to death, he was able to view that progress in sexual terms. He described the oral stage, which is the stage of infancy, where a child derives its sexual pleasure by way of its mouth. And Freud sexualizes the whole concept of breastfeeding. Then he shifts into this explanation of human development from the oral stage to the anal stage. In the anal stage, defecation becomes the focus. Focus externally for the child. Focus curiosity-wise as the child is progressing and maturing. This then leads to the phallic stage. It's a period of development marked by self-gratification, which then leads to the final stage. And if you're an adult in the room, according to Freud, this is the stage that you're in. It's called the genital stage, where your complete focus is in finding a sexual partner and then experiencing as much sexual fulfillment as one can with that sexual partner. What Freud did is he gave wings to this idea that from birth to death, human beings are primarily sexual beings, driven by sexual pleasure. Truman says this concerning Freud. After Freud, there is no stage in life which sexual desire and its satisfaction are not foundational to human behavior. All that changes is the means by which individuals find this satisfaction. That's the only thing that changes. When you're an infant, you're motivated by sexual desire. When you're a toddler, you're motivated by sexual desire. When you're an adolescent growing, you're motivated by sexual desire. And when you're an adult, you're motivated by sexual desire. That was Freud's theory. Freud also accomplished this. He presented religion as childish and sexual morality as being nothing more than personal taste. Personal taste. Freud, for those of you that are familiar with him, he said there were three parts of your personality. There was the id, that's what you want, your desire. There was the ego, it's the more rational part of you that has to make decisions about how you live out or restrain those desires. And then there was something called the superego, which in Christian terms we might associate with the conscience. And this was your internalization of customs, conventions, expectations, rules of society in such a way that it becomes part of you. So Freud would say something like this concerning religion. This is from his book, Future of an Illusion. Here's what Freud said. Religion is a store of ideas created, born from man's need to make his helplessness tolerable and built up from the material memories of helplessness of his own childhood and the childhoodness of the human race. End quote. So Freud was one of the first to say something like this. Religion is a crutch. Religion is a sign, if you believe in it, that you have not evolved along with the rest of society. At the end of the day, religion, all that it can be really anchored in is your superego, which the superego at its absolute reduction is just personal taste. That's all it is. Freud, like Rousseau, believed that the greatest purpose in life was to pursue happiness. And Freud's psychoanalytic theory posited that genital pleasure was the greatest means of happiness and the driver of mature human behavior. So, according to Truman, I'm going to give you another quote from Truman. He says this, Freud provided a compelling rationale for putting sex and sexual expression at the center of human existence and all its related cultural and political components in a way that now grips the social imaginary of the Western world. Freud has provided the West with a compelling myth that sex, in terms of sexual desire and sexual fulfillment, is the real key to human existence, to what it means to be human. Let me finish the quote. The purpose of life, according to Freud, and the content of a good life is found in personal sexual fulfillment. This principle also reorientates thinking on the purpose of sex. The purpose of procreation is subordinated to the purpose of personal pleasure. He focuses on the conflict between natural sexual desires and the sexual restrictions demanded by civilized society. Let me hit this, then we'll move to the final point, because I think this is huge. Freud said this: in society, you have to make a choice. On one hand, you have all these sexual desires. Here's the problem, according to Freud. If you just live in full accordance with your sexual desires, the result is like anarchy. It's not good. So you have to temper your sexual desire with your desire for peace and security. So it's either sexual fulfillment, which leads to anarchy, or, in Freud's mind, you pursue peace, security through civilization, but if you do that, there'll be great sexual frustration. That's Freud's idea. He wrote a book entitled Future as an Illusion, and in this book, Future as an Illusion, we see the impact of Freud's thoughts on education. Think about this for a minute. Here's what Freud said concerning education. It's in the form of a question. So chew on this question. Here's what Freud said. Is it not true that the two main points of the program for education of children today is retardation of sexual development and premature religious influence? Freud looked at education, and he said, you know what I discern in education? Educators are concerned with two things: keeping people from acting out their sexual desires and educating them religiously. That's what he thought education was. And through that question, he's questioning that construct, and he's proposing the opposite idea. Freud is proposing an educational mindset where we become preoccupied with liberating childhood sexual expression and religious influence. What are we seeing right now in our culture? We want to limit anyone who would suggest there is a norm for sexual identity. There is a norm for gender roles. There is a norm for sexually approved behavior. We want to eliminate that. And what do we also want to make sure doesn't get into the school at all? Religious education. No religious education. Freud has had a huge impact. So let's step back for a moment and let's consider the progress. First, you have Rousseau. Rousseau says this: be true to yourself. Then you have Freud, who comes along and says this: your true self is essentially sexual. So Freud says, yes, be true to your true self, but understand this: your true self is primarily sexual. Now, this sets us up. Now, you might say, well, Seth, you can stop there. You have just described why the world is so absorbed with sex. No, we're missing one major element. One major element. This is the third individual, Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich, who was a disciple of, not Freud directly. Wilhelm Reich was a disciple of Karl Marx. But Marx was a huge fan of Sigmund Freud. So there is an ideological connection. Okay, who is Wilhelm Reich, and why is he so significant to the world in which we live today? Well, he wrote a book, 1933, called The Psychology of Fascism. And in this book, here's what he's wrestling with. He's frustrated. He's a Marxist, and he's frustrated because something just happened in Russia. In Russia in 1905, there was an uprising of the working man against the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and they won. They overthrew the capitalists. But what they did next shocked the Marxists. Once you overthrow the capitalists, you're not supposed to then reinstate them in power. And that's exactly what happened in Russia. They reinstated the very leaders that they overthrew. And so those that were committed to Marxist thoughts were trying to understand, how did this happen? So Wilhelm Reich writes a book, The Psychology of Fascism. Now here's why Wilhelm Reich is significant. Reich regarded Freud as being instructive, but he didn't take his ideas far enough. Freud spent a lot of time focusing on subconscious and the impact of the subconscious on human behavior and the impact of your relationship with your father upon your behavior in adulthood. So Reich comes along and says this: the soldiers supported the Tsar in Russia against their political interests because they instinctively both feared and desired to please the Tsar as a kind of father figure. Okay? The significance of Reich is revealed in another book that he wrote called Mass Psychology. Listen to what he says here. The interlacing of socioeconomic structures with the sexual structure of society and the structural reproduction of society take place in the first 4 or 5 years in the authoritarian family. It becomes the factory in which the state's structure and ideology are molded. All right, let me paraphrase that. Here's what Reich observes. Do you know why we failed in 1905 in Russia? From the Marxist perspective. Here's why we failed. We didn't realize how much the traditional family, in the early ages of a child's maturation and upbringing, the traditional family influences the child in such a way that it's resistant to overthrowing its father's immaturity. So here's the shift from Reich. Reich, here's the shift. He politicizes sex. So following Reich, if you're a Marxist, it's not enough to just talk about class. The poor versus the rich. The landowners versus the working man. That's not enough. You have to attack the class distinctions, but you also have to undermine the family. You have to destroy this structure that is preparing youth to honor their fathers, to want to please them. Because the youth will never rise up in rebellion and throw off the current political machinery if they're allowed to continue to be influenced by the traditional family in the way that they are. He said, now listen to this, the family was the factory in which the state's structure and ideology are molded. Now, he's not saying that because he wants to promote it. He would sound a lot like Moses if he was wanting to promote the importance of the family, the importance of early childhood training. No, he's saying this is the enemy and this must be undone. Truman explains the significance of Reich. He says this, and I quote, "The traditional patriarchal family is a unit of oppression." The traditional patriarchal, okay, what's that term mean? Patriarchal, father-led family. The traditional family led by a father is an agent of oppression. Reich continues in this book, Mass Psychology. He says this, morality's aim is to produce acquiescent subjects who, despite distress and humiliation, are more adjusted to the authoritarian order. Thus, the family is the authoritarian state in miniature, to which the child must learn to adapt himself as a preparation for the general social adjustment required of him later. End quote. So, following Reich, here's the shift at Reich. Marxism seeks to destroy the traditional family. Now, what does this have to do with sex? Well, Reich didn't stop writing. Here's the conundrum for Reich. How do we destroy the traditional family? Moms and dads are probably not going to be for that. How do we destroy the traditional family? So he wrote the next book, and I'm just going to give you the title of the book, and you can guess where it goes. Here's the title of the book: The Sexual Revolution. Now, what do you guess Reich will propose in his book, The Sexual Revolution? We can't come at the family through the front door. The dads won't let us in. But if we can sexually liberate society so as to redefine the traditional family, we'll have accomplished our objective. And the youth will be prepared to overthrow or cast off the current society structures. They'll be more welcoming towards Marxism, socialism. Now, let me give you a quote from this book, The Sexual Revolution. The free society will provide ample room and security for the gratification of natural needs. So here's his utopic vision. Reich says, if we're successful, here's what a good world looks like. And I want you to think, is this modern America? And I'm suggesting to you, we're real close. Here's what Reich says. The free society will provide ample room and security for the gratification of sexual needs. Do we do that as a society? Do we provide ample room and opportunity for youth to satisfy themselves sexually? You now have parents who have this type of mindset. Well, it's going to happen anyway, so might as well happen under my roof because at least I know they're safe. Continuing with Reich, thus, it will not only prohibit a love relationship between adolescents, it will not only prohibit a love relationship between two adolescents of the opposite sex, but it will give it all manner of social support. All right, that's kind of a wordy way of saying this. This new society will actually help young people who want to be sexually active. The new society will. They won't restrain them, won't caution them to wait till marriage or even encourage marriage. It will just encourage them to be sexually indulgent. Such a society will not prohibit child self-gratification, but on the contrary, will probably conclude that any adult who hinders the development of a child's sexuality should be severely dealt with. Think about that. Think about that. He views the future society as being so transformed. Who are the bad guys in the future society? Who are the bad guys? The ones who would actually prohibit sexual development. The one who would dare say sexual self-gratification is wrong and unhealthy for youth. That person will be the enemy in the new society. The one who would prevent two adolescents from engaging in sexual activity, that will be the enemy. The parent who says, no, you cannot transition through hormonal therapy or gender reassignment surgery, that will be the enemy. Friends, are we not at that doorstep as a society? I believe that we are. Reich said that the state should have power to intervene on family matters because the family would be the primary opponent of political liberation by way of its teaching and enforcing sexual codes. This was the world that Reich envisioned. Dad, who wants to be a God-honoring dad, you are Reich's number one enemy. You're the number one transgressor within the culture. Here's the summary. Reich politicized sex. Now, this is seen further. We're not going to focus on this guy, but there's a disciple of Reich. His name is Herbert Marcuse. He wrote a book entitled Eros and Civilization, and he argued that the traditional sexual ethics are a repressive weapon of Christian capitalism. Therefore, Christian capitalism must be overturned. And the means of the overturning is unrestrained sexual experimentation. In other words, a sexual revolution. So back to the question, why is society so consumed with sex and sexuality? Why? Again, from the Christian perspective, we're not consumed with sex and sexuality. We're consumed with Christ. Christ has commanded us to disciple the nations. We're to teach them to observe all things. We have a responsibility to defend the Christian sexual ethic, to promote it as the ideal for the good of our society, and to point men and women who are bound by sexual enslavement to freedom in Christ through the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the Christian response. What's the world's response to this question? Why is society so consumed with sexuality? It's because sex has become their Messiah. And here's what I mean by that. Last statement. How is sex the modern Messiah? Well, from a Christian perspective, what will Messiah do? Messiah will usher in the kingdom of God. Messiah will bring heaven to earth. So how is sex the modern Messiah? Because it's through sexual liberation that we'll find political freedom, individual identity, and personal authenticity. We will only find those three through sex.